俄罗斯正在对乌克兰发动的战争已经引发全球震荡。
So in essence, I see Putin's ambition.
这是二战结束近80年来欧洲爆发的最大规模的战争，也是冷战结束后对一个主权国家最大规模的入侵行动。
乌克兰的表现已经超出很多军事专家以及情报人员预测，俄罗斯的进展是非常缓慢，从一个闪电战变成一个拉锯战。
We in the West have short-term objectives so that they pay more for it.
Today, I'm announcing the United States is targeting the main artery of Russia's economy. We're banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy.
When we had an opportunity after the Soviet Union fell, we didn't pursue a mini Marshall Plan, which would have helped bail out and turned Russia around and brought them into the international system. The Russians are our natural allies against our real threat in the world. It's Communist China.
欢迎来到金庸论坛，我是 David。这是冷战后最接近第3次世界大战的时刻。冷战后到目前为止，国际形势到底发生了什么样的变化？俄罗斯为什么要在此刻发动这场战争？这场战争将走向如何？以及它将会为世界格局带来什么样的后果和影响？我们今天邀请到3位嘉宾来一起探讨这些话题。第一位是军事及战略研究员，美国前海军上校 Stu Swerk。Stu, it's great to have you on Pinnacle View.
谢谢 David。
下一位是 Bradley Thayer 先生，他是美国智库应对中共当前危机委员会的创始成员。Bradley, it's great to have you here as well.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
然后是我们的现场嘉宾 YouTube 军事频道探索10分主播周子定先生。周子定你好。
主持人你好，各位观众朋友你好。
周先生，我们现在请您介绍一下目前的这个俄国军队的情况啊，就是他们现在在这个战争中的表现如何？就是您可以讲一下关于这场战争中俄国的一些成功和他们一些失败的一些分别之处吗？
那俄罗斯本来的目的是打一场像2战时期德国那样的闪电战，但打到现在啊，这个局势已经演变成一个1战时期的拉锯战。那俄罗斯明显是一开始轻敌了，那普京可能觉得72小时他就能控制整个乌克兰，但是从总统泽连斯基一直到乌克兰居民，他们的反抗意志非常强，这就导致俄罗斯在南北东3条战线上都进展非常缓慢。我们从南线说起啊，南线本来俄罗斯的军队从克里米亚出兵，西路军是打赫尔松这个城市，但是俄罗斯在赫尔松停滞了很长时间。在西线呢，马里乌波尔这个城市已经被包围了，但是在东线哈尔科夫，我们知道哈尔科夫距离俄罗斯只有不到100公里，而北边的基辅，包括东北地区的苏美，距离俄罗斯也就是100公里的左右。但是直到目前为止，3个城市啊，像钉子一样牢牢地钉在了俄罗斯和乌克兰的前线，所以俄罗斯对于这些城市，对于巷战，它是没有打赢的这个机会的。所以综合来说，到目前为止，俄罗斯的进展是非常缓慢，从一个闪电战变成一个拉锯战。那这场战役可能会持续更长的时间，超出普京以及俄罗斯军方高层之前的想象。
Stu, let me ask you, Stu 先生，普京为什么会发动这场战争？然后他希望在这场战争中得到什么 ？To gain from it?
Well, nobody knows for sure other than Putin and his inner circle, but there's kind of a evolving general consensus that there's probably 3 or 4 different reasons. One is he wants to disarm the Ukraine. He wants a buffer state between Russia and the rest of NATO. He also wants to make sure that Ukraine itself is neutral with no NATO membership. He's been railing against NATO for years. Another reason is he would like to get formal recognition of Crimea as being part of Russia, because the Russians want a warm water port in the Black Sea. And lastly, I believe that he's interested in installing a pro-Russian central government to replace the current government in this country.
So, Stu 先生，您觉得他会成功吗 ？Succeed in this goal?
Well, I would say that at present there's too many variables to consider. Things could go a number of different directions. Can he absorb all of the sanctions that are being piled on him? Can he withstand any domestic pressures that might be building, including amongst his inner circle who are feeling financial pressures because they're being personally sanctioned? Will his cronies actually support him continuing on? Will China buy his oil, gas, and coal, or will they choose to genuflect to the sanctions that are being placed on him? Will NATO support that does trickle into Ukraine have a real impact in halting the Russian army advances? What about Zelensky himself? Will he be taken out? Will he be forced to leave the country? Or perish the thought, if he were assassinated or killed, what do you suppose that might do to Ukrainian morale over time? And lastly, what will the U.S. do, if anything at all? It's not really clear what we're going to do at this point. So there's a lot of variables that are still in play here. Will he succeed? I think it's at least 50-50. I mean, he's got the intestinal fortitude. It looks like he's achieving his limited objectives, but we won't know for some time yet.
As a follow-up to both you, Brad and Stu, for you guys， 我想问一下，就是关于说，相对过去的这个苏联政府和现在的这个现俄罗斯政府的话，他们之间的不同，以及就是说他们的这个国家战略是什么 ？Then and now.
That's a critically important question. To some degree, there's an overlap between Soviet grand strategy and Russian grand strategy. The Soviets were far more powerful, and they had hegemonic aspirations. Thankfully, they were defeated by the United States and its allies in the Cold War. Russia is a great power. It's not a hegemonic challenger to the United States. So it's significantly weaker than the Soviet Union. However, its grand strategy is also expansionistic, as we're witnessing, that Putin, and I agree with Stu's summary, that Putin's ambitions are to, in essence, recreate the greater Russia. He has a allied state in Belarus. He seeks to create one in Ukraine. And in Central Asia, he has largely governments that are positively inclined, allies of the Soviet Union, although it's important to note that Central Asia is contested between China and Russia, and that's a source of tension. So in essence, I see Putin's ambition, his grand strategic aims to recreate a greater Russia.
I would agree with Brad's comments, and I would add that historically the Russians have been invaded multiple times over the centuries. And inside the Russian psyche, there is this fear, if you want to call it, of invasion, and it's real. I can remember watching a black and white movie on PBS a few years ago. It's called Alexander Nevsky. It was done by the Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein. And Nevsky was a Russian hero because he stopped the Teutonic Knights invasion back in the 13th century. And interestingly enough, Stalin played that movie over and over during World War II as the Nazis were on approaching the gates of Moscow, because he knew it resonated with the Russians in the Russian army who were trying to stop the Nazis. So there's that ingrained psyche that the Russians have. They're concerned about border security. They've been invaded many times before. I agree with what Brad was saying about the Russian need to build a greater Russia and to have an sort of a buffer zone, if you will, between Russia and the rest of the world because of this fear of invasion that they have. And it's very consistent with what Putin has been saying along those lines. And it does resonate with the Russian people because there's that ingrained psyche that has been built up over many centuries.
关于俄国的这个军力啊，它有没有构成说对整个欧洲的这么一个威胁呢？
我并不觉得俄罗斯有威胁的能力，因为我们看俄罗斯目前打乌克兰就已经打成这个样子了。那我们看，除了波罗的海三国，芬兰、瑞典，他们其实都有非常强大的军事实力，包括芬兰最近刚刚采购了美国的 F-35战斗机。那对于俄罗斯来说，它目前已经动员了超过92%，它部署在边境的这些军力，到现在还没有拿下乌克兰，所以他想发动一场对欧洲大陆或者对波罗的海三国或者对于北约盟国的一些进攻，我觉得对于他来说，他目前就算有这样的野心，他们也没有这样的能力。
跟进一个问题啊，就是说关于这个普京这次他有进行这种核威胁的这么一个动作，您对这个有没有什么看法？
我觉得普京并不是真的想使用核武器，因为核武器对人来说是一个灾难。他提出这样更多的是威胁，或者是更多的是源于乌克兰战场上对俄军不利的情势。那他有一点着急了，会有一点疏急了。那对于他来说，他把核武器这个牌打出来，就是想警告西方国家不要再对乌克兰进行支援，或者不要想着设立禁飞区，或者是不要想着用其他的方式来干涉乌克兰。所以我觉得对于普京而言，他并不是真的想打核战争，而是想去以俄罗斯非常强大的核力量去威胁西方国家。
This Russian invasion is slowly getting. Brad 先生，我想请您讲一下，就这次对乌克兰入侵以后，您觉得他对这个未来全世界的这种世界秩序，然后以及就是冷战之后的这个世界秩序，它会有什么样的变化 ？End of World War II.
Well, it certainly is a fundamental challenge to it. The liberal international order has been eroded principally by China and the actions of the Chinese regime, which have explicitly targeted the liberal international order and U.S. position in international politics. The current events in Ukraine serve two major elements with respect to that. First, it temporarily, perhaps, but it definitely unifies the West, United States and its allies in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Europe to oppose Russia. And Russia has made the decision, in essence, to bandwagon with China. I believe that's a profound mistake on behalf of Putin, and he'll regret that in the not too distant future. The second component is that Putin has, through these actions, through this heavy-handed mechanism, ensured that he's a pariah in the West, and with the sanctions and other measures that have been taken and that will be taken in the near term and perhaps in the longer term as well against Russia, he's going to find himself extremely isolated in the West, and that's going to serve as to really strengthen his need to go to China cap in hand. So that's not a good way to go to the Chinese regime. So Putin, in some respects, the West, because he's unified it, that's a very important aspect. But the fact that if he does move to any type of tightening alliance with the Chinese regime, that's a profound danger to the present liberal international order.
It seems the obvious. 俄罗斯有大概4次想要加入北约，这件事情就没有达成。但是现在呢，我们发现一个问题，就是说为什么北约和俄罗斯不能形成一个盟友关系，或者是一个联合的关系 ？Times actually.
Well, I would say that there's been a lot of water under that bridge over the last 50 years or so. It could be possible, but the geopolitical scene would have to change dramatically. I mean, you have to go back to Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a Polish guy who had a deep sense of concern about the Soviet Union. This was back when the Soviet Union still existed. He even talked about in those days having some kind of a vision for like an American global hegemony over the Eurasian landmass, which would extend all the way from France into Ukraine, interestingly enough. So that's the late 70s. And other statesmen lately have been over the years have made comments that this notion of extending NATO to the borders of Russia would basically precipitate exactly the type of scenario we're seeing unfold in Ukraine. There were people like George Kennan and Henry Kissinger and a bunch of other folks have predicted in the past that this is exactly what was going to happen. So, there's been this building distrust amongst the Russians when we had an opportunity after the Soviet Union fell to actually do something to help bring them into the Western capitalist system. In reality, we didn't do it. We pushed NATO to the borders. We started making deals with Ukrainian oligarchs over time. We didn't pursue a mini Marshall Plan, which would have helped bail out and turned Russia around and brought them into the international system. we really didn't do the right thing with respect to pushing NATO, and that has caused the serious problem that we have. I think personally that the Russians are natural allies against our real threat in the world. We have a mutual threat, and that, just as Brad pointed out, it's communist China. And the fact of the matter is, what's going to be reshuffled in the deck of geopolitical and economic affairs is all of the different trade relations that will be adjusted as a result of this ongoing sanctions and the war itself. I mean, Russia is going to try to sell as much or try to export as much of its hydrocarbons as it possibly can to the Chinese. And since the Chinese are energy poor, they're going to accept as much as they possibly can. It's to their advantage. But over the long run, as Brad pointed out, I think the Russians are going to regret doing that. But it's going to change how the rest of the world operates too. Will Western Europe be able to rely on future gas from Russia after this is all over? What about all of the countries that are reliant on agricultural exports from both Ukraine and Russia? I mean, there are a number of countries that have over 50% of their food supply come from those two countries. Is that going to continue in the present war situation? Don't know. So there's a lot of reshuffling of the deck on the economic front that's going to take place, and whether we can do something and whether we can bring Russia into a more formal alliance, if you will, that's focused on confronting the real threat, China, it remains to be seen. It's going to be a long pole in the tent to pull that off.
So yeah, the question,在前川普总统的时候呢，是有一定程度上把俄罗斯当做了是一种可以合作伙伴的关系，或者是盟友的关系。而现在的拜登政府呢，显然是把俄罗斯作为像是冷战时期的这种敌人的这么一种关系。对你两位来讲，哪一个是一个比较正确的路线呢 ？Brad, go first, please.
That's critically important. The right approach is to ensure that Russia does not ally with China from the standpoint of U.S. interests and the stability of the liberal international order. And so we recognize that Russia has tremendous difficulties historically with the West as a result of the Cold War in its aftermath. But Russia also has profound and even more profound problems with China. So a strategy of triangulation is one where that we would want Russia to be closer to us than it is to China seems to be the right approach. And I believe Trump was moving along those lines, recognizing that it was China is the center of gravity. China is the threat to the United States, to the West, the liberal international order, and to Russia. And so having some type of positive security relationship with Russia directed against China was obviously a strategic lodestar. The Biden administration, as you observed, is reversing that. And now, obviously, with the events in Ukraine, it's going to be very difficult to return to, in the short term at least, perhaps in the longer term, the tremendous growth of China's power and its aggression is going to compel Russia, if not under Putin, under some other leader, or perhaps under Putin in time, that he's made a terrible mistake and needs to reverse course. And likewise, the West is increasingly recognizing the threat from the Chinese regime and the need to respond to it. In international politics, you often don't get to choose your allies. And I don't know that we would choose Russia as an ally, but it needs must. We must work out some type of relationship with Russia to ensure that it does not bandwagon with China, which would put the West and the United States in particular in a much more difficult two-front war strategic situation. Well, I was simply observing that we want to we don't get to choose our allies oftentimes in international politics. Russia is far from perfect in every respect, but nonetheless, the fact that China threatens it as well as the West and really the global international order compels us to work out some type of relationship with the Russians to ensure that they do not bandwagon with China and work with the West and the rest of the liberal international order to accurately deal with the threat posed from the Chinese regime.
I'll just add to Brad's excellent comments that it takes two to make a deal. And what we have to do is we can't approach Russia from the point of view of exclusively our own needs and objectives. The Russians actually have valid concerns too about security, as we discussed previously. They're interested in engagement with the West. They also want to have the sanctions that have been ongoing for a long time be relaxed, and they would like to have expanded trade relations because their export of oil and gas is the bulk of their economic benefit. So we have to understand that it's a two-way street, and what we need to do is establish a bona fide treaty or a pact or alliance or something along those lines that engages and talks about the binding security agreements that each side has that are valid, and then we can go on from there in terms of refocusing our efforts against the Chinese.
And Brad, I want to focus on the present now because the situation, like you both mentioned, Brad and Stu, is that Brad 先生，我想问一下，就在于北约东扩这个问题上，美国你觉得会让步吗？然后还有就是说，我们能否在北约和乌克兰之间说乌克兰让它保持一个中立的这么一个关系的 the NATO alliance?
Well, I would observe 3 points. First, NATO is already expanding to Sweden and Finland as a result of Russian actions. So we should anticipate that both Sweden and Finland have a long history of cooperation with NATO, although, of course, they have not been a part of it. As a result of Russia's actions in Ukraine, I think we should expect that one or both will be entering NATO fairly soon. Beyond that, I don't think NATO is going to expand. The Bucharest summit in 2008, when President George W. Bush wanted to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, but was rebuffed by the French and the Germans, really was the high watermark of NATO expansion to the east. It might be possible that if there is a rump state, a rump Ukrainian state, perhaps west of the Dnieper to some degree, in what was traditionally Polish territory, there might be some type of security relationship that NATO might have with that rump Ukrainian state if, in fact, Russia does conquer Ukraine east of the Dnieper River. But I think we've reached the high watermark of NATO expansion. Thirdly, I would just underscore, everyone recognizes, of course, the horrible humanitarian tragedy which is occurring, but bringing Ukraine into NATO is, as these events have underscored, is a profoundly sore spot for Russia. So Ukraine, as it presently exists, is not at all likely to come into the NATO alliance, and neither is Georgia as a result of these events, Russian aggression previously, but as a result of the aggression against Ukraine. It's very likely, despite some desire in Georgia to join NATO, that the Georgians will not be successful in that attempt.
The follow-up to this question, Brad 先生，对于解决乌克兰这个问题上，怎么能让美国和欧洲最有力达到他们应该想要的结果 ？Ukraine situation now.
Well, of course, it's a profound challenge in every respect. The humanitarian component of it, the strategic aspect of it as well. In terms of resolving it, it will be resolved by Russia and Ukraine. This crisis will be solved by Russian power and by Ukrainian power. And given that Russia has more, despite poor performance in many respects, it's quite likely that Ukraine is going to be ground down, either in totality or in the bulk of the Ukrainian state. And a new government put in place, a temporary Russian occupation or a longer-lasting Russian occupation that leaves in place a regime much like in Belarus, which is very positively, which is essentially a puppet of Moscow in that capacity. So that's certainly a lamentable and a tragic situation, but that is, I think, the most likely outcome of these events. We need to recognize that NATO is not going to become involved explicitly. There's always the danger of inadvertent escalation, which we have to be very sensitive to that problem. But Ukraine is not a member of NATO, of course, and NATO, its obligations are to its members and principally. So there's much that can be done to help Ukraine in a humanitarian capacity. In a military capacity has been advanced. But beyond that, we need to recognize the limitations of the ability of the alliance to save and to resolve favorably from the alliance's point of view this tragic situation.
俄国入侵乌克兰这件事情的这么一个现象呢，是俄国现在是努力的向前进，但是乌克兰的反抗和这种防御也是非常的重要。那么想问一下，他们对这个入侵的这个防御的最大的亮点是什么？还有就是他们能不能赢得这场防御战？
其实这场战役打到现在，乌克兰的表现已经超出很多军事专家以及情报人员预测。因为我记得战争开始的时候，美国情报人员估计是基辅会在96个小时之内沦陷，那莫斯科觉得可能72个小时它就能控制乌克兰。那打到现在，就是说乌克兰最让全世界人民刮目相看的就是他抵抗的意志，包括总统泽连斯基。那之前有个消息就是说，泽连斯基和美国使馆通电话，美国使馆说，问他考虑不考虑撤走。那泽连斯基说的是，我需要的是弹药，我不需要的是撤走。那可见，他和阿富汗总统加尼就形成了鲜明对比。我们知道去年的时候，美国从阿富汗撤军，那塔利班的部队还没有到达首都喀布尔的时候，加尼听到这个消息就坐直升机跑了。那俄罗斯已经打到基辅了，泽连斯基还不走，这就形成了鲜明对比。所以我们知道，这个领导人对一个国家它的作用是非常大的。那么在泽连斯基的这些感召之下吧，所以乌克兰的士兵抵抗力是非常强烈的。我看到很多视频说，虽然俄罗斯占领了一部分地区，但是很多乌克兰民众走上街头去抗议啊，包括在很多城镇，像大家可能比较忽视，像苏美地区，像那个哈尔科夫地区。打到现在抵抗力非常强硬。哈尔科夫几天之前，俄罗斯兵分三路已经打到哈尔科夫市中心了，但是被乌克兰军队给击退了。那这是一方面，就是战斗的意志；另外一方面是武器装备的运用。这一点就不得不提到外国的援助。我们知道，就是美国在前几天刚刚把价值大概5亿美元的军事援助送到乌克兰，包括德国前2天也表态，将要向乌克兰赠送大概500套的刺针防空导弹以及1000套左右的反坦克设备，包括芬兰。我们知道芬兰它是一直它虽然是欧盟，但是一直是一个军事上中立的国家。它前2天也向乌克兰赠送了大量的步枪以及反坦克设备。这些国家大量的武器援助，使得乌克兰它有足够武器装备去对抗俄罗斯。比如说有3个武器装备，一个是美国的标枪反坦克导弹，一个是英国和瑞典生产的恩烙反坦克导弹，包括美国自己的这个刺针防空导弹，在这次战斗中表现非常出色。乌克兰的防空体系仍然在运作，因为俄罗斯到目前为止有2架伊尔76被打掉了。伊尔76是俄罗斯主要的运输机，它是运送俄罗斯空降军的。那每架伊尔76大概能搭载100多个伞兵，那2架打下来就是200多人伤亡。俄罗斯空降军的一名少将已经被击毙了。就是说，我看到前方很多照片或者视频传出来，就是标枪和恩烙，就是打的俄罗斯坦克，不管你是 T72也好 T90也好，你的 ERA 就是反应装甲没有起到你想要的作用，全部被打的是非常难看。所以第2点就是乌克兰在武器运用，在国际社会的军事援助下，武器运用的是比较好，所以取得了这样的一个效果。所以第3点，我觉得就是乌克兰的战术运用的比较妥当，因为我们知道乌克兰的装甲力量相对俄罗斯来说比较薄弱。乌克兰战前大概有1000多辆坦克主要是老式的 T64 以及 T64 的改进型 T64BV， 然后外加一些少量的 T80以及 T84。那俄罗斯以 T72 为主，当然还有 T80和 T90。俄罗斯坦克数量大概4000多辆，是远远超过乌克兰。所以乌克兰如果在大平原上和俄罗斯打装甲集群的对战，像二战那样打，是没有胜算的。但是乌克兰收缩到城市，以城市以及城市郊区为核心，打一些防守的作战，打一些小的巷战，那么俄罗斯装甲集群在平原上的优势就没了，因为它进入到城市里，它像标枪或者恩烙，它都采用软发射，它在建筑物里面就可以发射，所以对俄罗斯装甲部队造成很大的威胁。所以我这是认为乌克兰第3个亮点就是战术运用的比较妥当，就是说从平原决战变成了城市的作战。
请您预计一下下一步乌克兰这场战争的下一阶段会是什么样？
我虽然觉得乌克兰在过去一段时间作战的非常不错，但是对于近段的未来我并不是抱很乐观的预测，因为俄罗斯的军事实力超过乌克兰太多。那么目前进入相持阶段，下一部分的计划可能就是围城战，因为俄罗斯在头10天在巷战中遇到了很大的问题。那么接下来我们看到俄罗斯的计划就是遇到居民区比较多的大城市，它会绕过去，首先围城，然后向纵深发展。那么围城之后，它会切断这个城市的水电、食物、弹药的供应。那这样的情况现在就发生在乌克兰南部的重镇马里乌波尔。我今天看到的消息是，里面的指挥官说，大家都是没水、没吃、没粮。那这样持续下去，就是里面抵抗的意志或者抵抗的实力会逐渐衰弱。那马里乌波尔是一个中型城市，那如果这样的情况发生在基辅，我们知道俄罗斯目前在基辅北面云集重兵，它的目标就是想要去包围基辅，但这样的包围还没有完成。整个乌克兰军队在基辅西北部的方向，像布查或者是尔平这些地方的抵抗是非常强烈的，所以导致俄罗斯很难前进。但是时间一长了之后，就是说俄罗斯如果能够对基辅形成包围，切断基辅水电甚至和外界的联系，再加上俄罗斯强大的空中力量，那么从军事上讲，我觉得基辅变成一个孤城以后，长久以来是很难去和俄罗斯抗衡的。但是我这是从军事上讲，就是说如果我们跨过这个阶段，就是说再往后，就哪怕俄罗斯打下了基辅，打下了哈尔科夫，打下了乌克兰大城市，但是我现在看到的情况是，乌克兰大多数民众他是不欢迎俄罗斯目前的这个入侵的话，那么这个势必会演化成当年阿富汗战争的一个情况，就是很多人会去反抗俄罗斯或者俄罗斯扶植的一个新的政府。那我看到有消息说俄罗斯准备扶植亚努科维奇建立一个新的乌克兰政府，那么会对俄罗斯长期来说造成很大的麻烦。所以我认为短期来说俄罗斯军事上是有征服乌克兰的可能性，但是从长期来说可能俄罗斯最终还是要从乌克兰撤军。
So Stu, going back, Stu 先生，如果在这场战争持续发展下的话，美国会采取什么样的措施？他们已经采取了什么样的措施？还有，如果这场战争继续的打下去的话呢？会不会有类似于比如说军人秘密参战这么一种情况 ？Covert operation.
I don't see it happening. This administration has been reflexively anti-Russian, mostly because of domestic political reasons. The Russian dossier, Trump Russian dossier, and whatnot. There's been a lot of political capital invested by the Democrat Party in raising the anti-Russian flag. Just as they are reflexively anti-Russian, the Biden administration is reflexively anti-provision of any real military capability as a deterrent to the Russians. The only reason why the Ukrainians received those Javelin anti-tank weapons is because they were put in the queue by the Trump administration and delayed delivery by Biden during 2021. So, they missed the opportunity to actually provide Ukraine with a real deterrent capability against the Russian army. They waited a whole year, did nothing, and now they're rushing to try to put together an aid package. The problem with that is the horse is already out of the barn. And the Russians will look at providing any real military plus up as an escalation. It's one thing to fulfill previous agreements to provide aid and so forth, but while there's a hot war on to actually provide equipment to aid your adversary will certainly be viewed by the Russians as an escalation. I don't think it's a wise move. What will the U.S. do? I think we'll continue with the sanctions. We'll try to marshal support in the UN, which is a toothless body, but at least it'll be a geopolitical show if nothing else. I really don't see us doing much. Certainly not to end this conflict. I think Brad was exactly right. This is going to get down to it's the Russians versus the Ukrainians, and more than likely the Russians are going to win out because they've got a better capability. It looks like they're upping the ante with respect to the conduct of the war. They're using more measures to achieve their objectives. I'm afraid that's the way it's going to end up going.
So Brad, coming to 我们现在看到西方制裁俄国，俄罗斯和中国这边现在越来越走得越近，能否确定这些制裁是真正帮助我们达到不让俄国和中共之间达成更深的一种联盟的关系 ？From getting deeper.
Well, we prevent it from becoming deeper by conveying to the Russians that despite our differences, we're the lesser evil. That China is the far greater evil, and that should be transparent, and indeed transparent to Vladimir Putin, but he's made his choices with respect to Ukraine. He's following through with them, and so he's going to have to deal with the consequences. I think we want to recognize that we in the West have short-term objectives, and that is to increase the costs of this war on Russia. So that they pay more for it, and we do our best for humanitarian reasons and for strategic reasons to help Ukraine. But in the long term, Ukraine is not the fundamental issue. It's China and the consequences of its growth of its power and the aggression of the Chinese regime. So we need to ask, how can Russia help us with that? And as we move ahead with the implications of this war with Ukraine, we need to keep in mind that Russia is going to be more valuable in the conflict with China, with the competition with China, than Ukraine is going to be, very importantly. So we need to recognize that Russia has a self-interest in working with us against China, but we need to ensure that we're not doing anything here which is going to, for many years to come, rupture the possibility of any type of rapprochement with Russia once this humanitarian tragedy and military conflict is over. So that's the fundamental point to keep in mind. It is China which should be in the back of every leader of Western states as well as countries around the world, because it is the greatest threat to international stability and to the world, which has maintained stability in international politics really since the end of World War II and certainly since the end of the Cold War.
So Brad, follow. 对于这场战争，对美国来讲，他们会改变对于中共的战略吗？包括在台湾问题上。
Well, I would certainly hope so. That measures were being taken in the Trump administration to recognize Taiwan's vulnerability and to do what the U.S. should do to augment its conventional deterrent capability and perhaps provide a U.S. Extended deterrent capability, as we once had with Taiwan. The Biden administration has walked away from that. The Mullen mission, Admiral Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's mission to Taiwan, as well as with his colleagues, is an important step. But there's so much more that needs to be done to help Taiwan in this period of vulnerability. I think former Secretary Mike Pompeo was right that we should move towards recognition of Taiwan. And if not diplomatic recognition, de facto recognition of Taiwan, including urgently sending military equipment, expanding a U.S. presence in Taiwan, and welcoming allies, for example, the Indians, the Australian, and the Japanese, to assist us in Taiwan's defense.
对于中共如果要打台湾的话，这场台湾防御战这样的话有没有什么启示和需要借鉴的一些从这个乌克兰这件事情上来说？
台湾或者中华民国要有奋斗的意志。乌克兰现在这样局面是靠泽连斯基以及靠乌克兰人民自己争取来的。当你去 有绝对的意志去反抗别人的入侵的时候，那国际社会上就可能会给你更多的帮助。反观你像阿富汗，其实美国在过去20年给了阿富汗大量的经济、军事上的援助，但是当塔利班来的时候，你的总统第一反应是逃跑，你的人民不想反抗的话，不想对抗，不想保卫自己的自由以及自己的生活方式的话，那么再多的军事和经济援助都是没用的。所以我觉得从阿富汗和乌克兰看得非常清楚，第一就是台湾要有保卫自己的意志，第二从军事上来说，其实中共看到乌克兰战争打到这个份上，可能已经越来越不想去进攻台湾了，因为乌克兰相对俄罗斯来说，他们是有2000多公里的边境线，并且都是大平原，而台湾和中国大陆不一样，中间隔的是台湾海峡，台湾海峡平均长度达到160公里，宽的能达到200多公里。那台湾目前台湾的军事实力是要远远超过乌克兰的。乌克兰在战前大概只有70架左右的米格29和苏27，而台湾我们知道最新刚刚更新了 F-16V， 那 F-16V 目前已经有几十架飞机入役了，除此之外还有法国的幻象战机以及自己研制的 IDF 经国战机，所以空军实力按数量来说已经排到全球前10。那陆军来说呢，台湾刚刚采购了美国的M1A2T 坦克，那这款坦克是美国目前用的 M1A2C 的台湾特制版，它的战斗力是非常强的。除此之外呢，最近台湾采购了100套的鱼叉，400枚的鱼叉飞弹，增强了自己这个反登陆的能力，再加上台湾自主研发的导弹也不错，包括有雄风2、雄风3，所以台湾的军事实力是要远远超过乌克兰的。那么在面对这个台湾海峡天险的时候，其实中共在考虑对台湾入侵的时候，一定会有更多的军事上的顾虑。对。
那么今天的非常精彩的这个分析我要感谢3位嘉宾来到现场和我们进行这个讨论。感谢您收看这次精英论坛节目，我们会经常带给您专家们对热点话题的深度分析。请关注我们的节目，我是 David， 我们下次再会。